Welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout. Today's topic is navigating navigation in Craft CMS. My name is Ben Prizik from Barrel Strength Design. Straight Up Hangouts is presented by Barrel Strength Design and Pixel and Tonic. Today we have with us Matt Stein from Working Concept and Seth Giamanco from ModLab. Welcome, folks. So I'm going to give a little overview of what we'll be chatting about. Navigation is a broad topic, and I guess I kind of think of it as anything that helps us with findability of information. And I'm sure we can come up with a lot of different definitions. When I kind of was brainstorming the topic, I kind of wrote down a list of what we could be talking about, and it included site navigation, breadcrumbs, search, categorization and tagging, previous and next buttons, back to the top buttons. So the topic is by no means finite here, and today's focus, we're going to be focusing on site navigation, or those information architecture decisions we make while we're building out a website to help users know where to find the information on that website on the front end and make it easy for clients or businesses to be managing that organization of information in Craft CMS on the back end. So Craft, I think, gives us a lot of tools for this. However, they really don't have any tools that help us with information architecture. They give us a lot of different ways to create our navigation or organize it, but the system itself doesn't make any assumptions about how we do that on the front end, and it's up to us to figure out how to do it. So some of the themes we might get into are more control versus less control, more complexity versus less complexity, how much does it cost to set this up versus just update it. And I think that there's plenty of more that we'll get into. So if you have questions while we go along here, feel free to post them. There's a Q&A button on the Hangout, and we'll pull those into the conversation as we have a chance. All right, so Matt or Seth, do you have any initial thoughts on navigation as we get started? I'm going to jump into several examples in Craft after this, so we can talk about actual examples. But any thoughts up front?
Flexibility is challenging.
True.
So I think, you know, I mean, after doing maybe, you know, our first, you know, half dozen Craft builds, I mean, it applies to other aspects of content setup as well, but often figuring out how we want to offer navigation is a pretty interesting conversation, because there are so many different ways that you can approach it. In combination with there not being an out-of-the-box menu type feature, you know, it kind of it lends itself to, well, we could do it this way, that way, the other way, and you know, kind of actually trying some of these things has revealed, you know, various pros and cons, you know, in terms of, you know, what the client experience might be like, you know, the publisher experience using it.
Yeah, I find one of the biggest challenges each time is every problem is just so slightly different that it usually takes implementing one or two versions of what you think might work before you even know exactly what you think is going to be the best type of navigation for the site you're working on.
And that's where I am now. I'm hoping to have all my questions magically answered, even though I don't know what a lot of them are yet. I came from expression engine categories. You know, that was my first way of building a navigation, and then relying on structure for things like breadcrumbs and everything, really, sitemap. And now I'm trying to figure out with my first really big Craft site how to manage a navigation and things like breadcrumbs and all that. So I've gone through several iterations of different navigations, and I'm curious to see what we get into.
Great. Well, we're going to start simple and work towards your latest challenge, Matt.
Thank you.
And Michael just made a comment. We have you on the list, Michael. So we'll get into plugins later in the chat, and we'll be talking about yours as well. Cool. So let me share my screen and start going down this list of different ideas we have here. So I'm going to start at the very beginning, and I think this is an often underappreciated option in navigation, which is hard code it. Does it even need to be manageable at all? I think a lot of projects that young developers or designers work on with clients kind of say yes to every option they get presented. Do you want it to be able to manage the navigation? And they say, yeah, sure, we want to manage everything. We don't want to have to worry about anything else. And it's a costly decision sometimes to go down that path of managing navigation, and frequently it never gets updated. I've never had a client move the About navigation item to the left of the Home navigation item or complain that that wasn't possible. So yeah, starting there, hard code it. Any thoughts on hard coding navigation and when it's appropriate?
Oh, I think it's appropriate more frequently than we give it credit for. To your point about how often do these things change, but I think our decision making is often driven by design and by actually the context of what the navigational elements are. So looking at the example that you have up, for example, like adding a fifth navigation is actually would introduce an issue in that primary nav. Yeah. The design is uniquely suited for the four primary nav elements that are showcased there. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's a case and a decision and a conversation that would be had with the ultimate recipient of the site and the publisher, is to say, okay, we really have a pretty set presentation and structure here, and that generally we'll get to that design knowing that those things don't need to be flexible, and as a result, it might not merit having those elements be required to be managed directly by the client.
Which I think, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, for smaller sites, it actually turns out to be a benefit to the content editor, the person actually maintaining the site, because there's no, place where they have the 4 pages to manage where they can single-handedly obliterate their SEO by rearranging their sitemap every other day. So it's been, in a lot of cases for me, small sites are actually great when you get the navigation out of it and make it easier for the person maintaining things, or people maintaining things, to focus on the content and not the structure of the site. So it's been a benefit for me with smaller sites sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the other, I kind of is going to push the other end of that spectrum here. I think, yeah, simple navigation is one thing to just definitely consider hard coding it. You might not need to make it complex at all. And then we've got the other end of the spectrum, which is something like the New York Times. And here they've got navigation in top, front, center. They've got another navigation above that. They've got navigation for which language you want to look in. If you click sections up here, it opens up a whole side nav with drop-down navigation even within that. And I think that's an interesting question. If you have a site this complex, who needs to be updating this navigation, and what are the implications of even updating it? If you change the URL of the politics section accidentally, you've changed all of your SEO links to that section or whatever it is, and you might have other effects. So you need a certain level of technical knowledge of somebody managing an advanced site as well. And should that person be a content editor, or should they have to go through the extra step of going through a developer or a design process to request a change in the navigation, getting it approved, and getting it pushed live?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I mean, it's even in a very small way, I mean, even when we do a build where there is some degree of managing the menus, we usually let that be for the system admin, and we often will create an editor role who is the more day-to-day, for users that are more day-to-day content publishing. role. And again, because even when we do give the capability to make changes, just as you're highlighting, those changes should not be made lightly. So we put it at that higher level of decision making, albeit still very accessible, but that higher level, so it's not in their face day to day. When we can control that, and I know that'll get into other options of how you set things up.
Great. So yeah. So let's then consider. So we have this, like, let's say we have an advanced or a simple navigation, but we still want to make some relationship to how it's editable. So one approach to navigation is, many approaches approach it from how do we add support for it in the back end. Well, one of the approaches is we hard code it, or we only make it accessible on the front end. And I have Will Brower's admin bar plugin installed for this. I was going to give a quick demo. I think it illustrates the front end use case well. Here's a plugin. You can basically trigger it to put a link on the front end of your site. And if we reload Happy Logger now, we're going to see this dashboard bar up at the top. And what the plugin is doing is it's watching for which entry is loading, and it's giving us a link to the edit page for whatever page is loaded on the site. So now an admin who's logged in is able to navigate to anywhere they want to on the site, and whenever they get there, they are able to click the edit button and go right to where it is in the back end. I think this is an interesting approach. On one hand, you've kind of solved the problem of handling your navigation on the back end. On another hand, you're making it a little harder to know the content architecture of what you're working with on the back end, because every time you get to the back end, you're immediately at where you need to be. You never had to know how to get there. But it's a handy way, and this is just a plugin based implementation. You could write code that puts a little edit link next to any type of content that you're outputting on the front end. If you think that you've worked really hard on your front end navigation and it's really organized, and that's the way that most people are going to be finding the content they want to edit. All right. Well, so continuing down that path, let's start looking at ways we can manage this in the control panel then. So none of these examples that I have are tied into the actual website. They're just kind of conceptual examples of how we can approach the problem from Craft. So here we are with the, I think this is the easiest way I've thought of handling nav, is you just have a table field. It allows you to name the link and write in a link manually. Not very elegant, not free from user error, but if you have a more technical person who just needs a quick navigation, a really quick way to get up and running with a small navigation. All right, feel free to jump in, folks. I'm going to kind of just keep going. I know every one of these isn't a dissertation. Interesting. The next up, and we looked at this last week in our Matrix as a layout builder handout. Stephen Bowling went into a much longer example and even looking at some of the code around how to do this. But one that I find we use on a lot of small to mid-sized websites is just using Matrix as navigation. And so here we have a matrix field, and it has 3 different block types: the ability to link to an entry in the system, the ability to add a custom URL, and the ability to link to an asset. And a client can come in here and link to content in the system or reorder things fairly easily. If you have a couple different navigations, like a main navigation and a footer navigation or something, you could have 2 different matrix fields or 3 different matrix fields. But I feel if you get over 3, you start to push the boundaries of this method. If they're all 3 to 5 items and 3 different places on the site, you can kind of manage things fairly easily. And then after you start pushing that, it starts to feel like you've got a lot of custom fields around for your use case. Have you folks used any of these methods? Or?
I've used the matrix. Yeah, I think it's on our site. I think that was one of the first things that we tried that made sense to us. But again, I think that the major limitation is you're really just looking at one level deep. So you can't. There's no sub navigation possibility, at least that we've come up with. I mean,
yeah, the two ways I've heard
I think we've done that. But yeah, so I mean, if you're doing like a single level, this is really nice way to go. And one thought I haven't explored it, but I mean, there's even you could quote unquote simplify it or maybe enhance it with even not necessarily having you could do custom blocks as you shared, or you could use there's that nice that link it plugin which gives a lot of different linking possibilities from entry to external URL to asset within a single field type, which is kind of we haven't done that yet, but it was something I've thought about of just maybe an interesting combination of the two to address nav if you felt that there's like other types of assets. But I don't know that I would use it, but it was just something that I was thinking about as well recently.
Yeah, I think I've seen a couple of different approaches to sub-navigation in a simple navigation approach like this. One is if you're linking to, so let's say we're linking to an entry in a structured section, we link to the top level entry, and then in the code we're able to just output anything below that as subnav. So that would be maybe one approach to subnav. Another, and we've done it where you just have maybe 5 items in the navigation, and one of them is a more drop-down navigation item, kind of the catch-all drop-down that is the one drop-down item in the navigation. We might just have that drop-down as a separate matrix field kind of managed on its own as well. Again, very simple sub-navigation needs, not multi-hierarchy or anything. All right, shall we continue down the list?
Yes.
Press on.
All right, so now actually I was going to turn towards nav plugins next because I think they start to kind of address this additional complexity issue of where do we start going. And I've got 3 different ones installed: AMNAV, Familiar Menus, and Navin. So I'll just go down the list in alphabetical order here. So AMNAV has you can create multiple navigations. We can look at how we create those navigations. You can kind of choose a few things about them. Do they have, which entries can you have in them? How deep are they? Once you've created it, you can come in here and start to add items to your tree. So you can add entries, categories, assets, or custom URLs. And they kind of keep track of that stuff down here below here. So I'm just going to add one quickly here. I'm not going to worry about how much sense this makes. So I'll just kind of do a couple of things so we can see how it works. We'll create I don't know how we, I find this challenging with structures too. You always kind of have to. All right, so we can kind of create our navigation. It can be nice and complex. It could have multiple tiers deep, and they give us some meta information about what's going on the side here. All of these are going to be fairly similar. Familiar Menus allows you to create your menus in your settings area, and then you add new nodes to your menus, kind of like you add new entries to a structure here. So we'll add a new item to menu 1. I don't know if we have a contact page. It's not. All right. Okay, our contact page. All right. So So again, they let us do that, and just they look to be extending Craft's nested set functionality, their structure style functionality, where you can reorder and drag and drop in this very similar way to how you're managing Craft structure section. And then Navi, again, very similar. You can create your nav sections here in your add edit, and then once you have them, you add new nodes to your tree. We'll add our contact node, and Navi actually goes a step farther than the others here in allowing you to add custom fields when you set things up, and it has a lot more default fields that allow you to kind of decide if you want to add a class or an ID or various other things to your navigation. So it gives you a little more upfront that it feels is necessary as you build out your navigation to make it work the way you want it to. And again, I'm kind of picking random things here.
Ben, curious, those attributes, are those always there, or are those fields that you set up?
Those were always there. I didn't see any option to configure what is there.
Right on. So
yeah, here's the creation process. So Navi actually gives you the ability to add custom fields to your navigation. So if you wanted you had a flyout navigation at the top, and you wanted an image or an ad or something in that navigation, it starts to give you more control over the fields that you might associate with the different nodes in your navigation. So, but yeah, it's a lot of fields up front if you don't need them there too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the other thing that these plugins start to offer is when you're coding out your site, maybe they have more optimized tags that make doing certain navigation things easier. When we're building our navigations custom with Craft, everything that we're doing in our code has to be custom as well. So I haven't overused these plugins, so I can't speak to their code, but I would expect that they have tags that kind of optimize the ability to output breadcrumbs or menus with drop-downs and whatnot there.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I've used the AMNAV one. We've done that for a couple builds. The other two are I think the menu one I was familiar with, and the Navi is pretty new, if I recall.
Yeah, I think Michael just released it within a week or so ago.
And the AMNAV one, I mean, it reminded me, again, coming from EE a little bit, it reminded me of taxonomy, whereas, seemed pretty lightweight and pretty raw in a sense, where you could really get at the raw data and kind of build out your nav, especially if you're using any front-end frameworks or any shortcut code that like we've had before, kind of wrapping in that nav, the dynamic elements into our front-end code is pretty clean.
They have examples of their code right here in the navigation of one tag to output it. It looks like, and they also have this display nodes. So if you needed to know which ID you were trying to work with on the front end for one reason.
But the interesting thing, I mean, that's the kind of thing that I don't like seeing. Similar to what you shared with like the Navi, with the all that extra stuff. I mean, nice for the dev, both of them. But in terms of trying to have a very clean, management experience, they again leave. There's just either extra information that a site manager doesn't need to see, or that could potentially lead to them entering stuff that you don't want them to enter.
Yeah, it's a lot of power. We tend away from the nav plugins, not because I don't think they have their place, just because, like what you're saying, I feel there's a trade-off of usability in them. The complexity that they add, it's a lot sometimes for the average content editor to take in, and I think they also I feel they also kind of go, I'm more of the hard code. I kind of start at the hard code it to reveal where I start. But I think when you do start going to the what needs to be manageable in the nav direction, very rarely is it the whole nav. Usually it's a specific part of the nav or a specific component of what the nav's trying to do. And a lot of times even like dynamic subnavigation is dynamic. It doesn't need to be managed, it just needs to be set up properly, and then every time somebody adds a new entry to the About section, it appears in the About subnav. And they don't need to choose exactly what's there, or if you want to start getting more advanced, maybe they want to reorder it to not be alphabetical or something like that. So if you can guide things in the let's let this be dynamic and just set up the content architecture in a smart way, there's a lot less coding that's necessary and a lot less errors or training that might need to happen.
Yeah. But that makes sense. And I think the other place where these come into play, though, is when you do need to manage the content, or you do need to manage the menus in a little more fine-grained way for whatever reason. I feel like there's a point when you try to do this out of the box that out of the box starts to feel a little bit like a Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
Just like you were saying at the beginning, where you were sharing that for you when you hit like that 3 or 4 matrix field, nav element, threshold, it starts to feel something. It just feels like not probably the right thing. And similarly, it's like I feel like when we've had some simple navs, and then you've got sub-navs in some areas, and the footer is a different thing. It's all of a sudden it starts to feel like managing that. If you have to go to more than like 2 places, and there's just I do this over here, and this is from over here, and this is from over here. That's where I found I like the idea of a plugin or some solution where at least then I could have a single source, that's managing all of those experiences in a more streamlined way. So even though you're adding that little bit of tech debt into the solution by adding the plugin, there's I think a point where it outweighs creating something that's just frankly sometimes hard to remember what's doing what.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with you want it as much in one place as possible, and the more you start spreading it out, the more confusing it gets. And I push the hard-coded way a lot because I think it's just under-considered, but I think there are very real needs when alphabetical just doesn't cut it for what you want your sub-navigation to be, because it doesn't prioritize anything in the right way of what the value of the business is, or what what's being offered or interesting to your customers. So.
Well, and for me, I feel like hard-coded breaks down, and the reason I've been looking at plugins is because somewhere I need to define some structure, not so much for the management of the navigation, but so that further into the depths of a bigger site, you can figure out where here is and what the path to it is. So figuring out how to display breadcrumbs, or like a partial sidebar navigation or something like that. I don't know if I'm missing some critical detail that would make it easier to hard code these things still, but determining the active location, and then not just previous URL segments, but the names of parent pages. That's where I get stuck with hard-coded navs, not being able to do that very well. But if there's a structure defined in the plugin, or even in a well, not really a matrix field, but usually I'm looking for something just to create that one structure that I can parse and figure out how to work with for navigation elements.
Yeah. Well, so let's then push this now and look at how we can start to kind of try to mimic these plugins in Craft. And I put this after the plugins because, like you said, Seth, I think you risk becoming a Frankenstein's monster. That if you start building this from scratch, you're essentially using Craft's tools to do what the plugins are trying to do, and so you have more control in some ways, but you also you have to figure out everything on your own from scratch. Each project you start doing that on. So let's take a look at. So I've got structures here. So I'm going to start here. So one thing I've done here, I've created so Craft, this is a cool thing, and I actually think Craft helps give us more options here to manage navigation with these features. So in the past, you could have created kind of a structure and it just sat in there with all your other content, and it just felt wrong because you'd have a content type that was an article or something next to a content type that was a navigation, next to a content type that was something else, and it just felt all jumbled and like you couldn't break things out. Well, Craft now lets us edit the sidebar of our section here and create custom headings and create, choose what goes under those headings, and even choose which fields display in the index page of those headings. So in this case, I've created a heading called Navigation. I've added 2 different structure sections which I created, one called Primary Nav and one called Complex Section. And I've updated the columns to only be displaying the title and the link. So we could, of course, update this to have different columns, but I'm just keeping it really simple for this. So now when I come to this primary nav section, it's very much like one of the plugins we just looked at. We have a index page that has our hierarchy for our navigation. We have a way to add new items to that navigation. And we have multiple navigations based on the structure sections we set up. So if we go into one of these, for example, we're kind of doing the same thing as we were doing in the matrix blocks. And again, this is just my quick implementation here. You have full reign on custom fields and what you choose to put here. In many of the navigation plugins, we saw things like open this in a new window or add your class name or other things. You can add fields for all of those things that you feel are necessary here. Like we had previously, we can choose our page and save it, and we kind of get a little different type of technical debt here. So I can add a new primary nav item and call it my contact page, which is a terrible example because it doesn't exist, but we'll hard code that one. And unlike the nav plugins, we now have all this kind of extra information that's really not relevant. Maybe slug is relevant or parent, but we don't care who the author of our navigation is or the post date or different things like that. So by using entries, we kind of benefit from using the system, but we don't benefit because the nav plugins are building out elements that are really focused on the problem at hand, not being reused for a different problem. So we can save that and see that we're able to just, drag and drop, and somebody can reorder and change the hierarchy of these just as the others.
Yeah.
All right, so we have one comment. Matt, hard-code navigation data in some twig object? From Marion.
Yeah, and I'm assuming you could just give an ID to each node within the twig object. It figures that Marion would have an idea how to do it in twig. But that's a pretty good idea. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So has Matt or Seth, have you used these structures ever to manage navigation?
I considered it at one point in time, and then I ended up, I think we considered that pretty early, and then nixed it for the matrix. But it was before 2.5, which, I mean, it is interesting how something small like being able to organize, your various section types, in that view, the way that you were highlighting makes a big difference. Because it's funny, I haven't considered going back to that structure approach, because I do remember feeling like it just felt out of place. Like it was just, okay, I've got this nav element mixed in with all my content. And I guess you can call that content of some sort. stretch it, but you know, being able to organize it, you know, might change my mind. I would be curious. I mean, you know, there's just, you know, as you're pointing out, you know, with the little bit of extra overhead. It's an interesting thought, but I mean, the other piece to it too is, you know, the idea that, I mean, you have, I mean, you could do this with the plugins too in terms of who can access it, but, you know, you could really have some nice controls over, you know, who would be able to manage the primary nav and your various nav related structures, you know, just using regular permissions. You know, to kind of limit it to, you know, just admins or, you know, even a subset of users to be able to have access to that. So as an out-of-the-box solution, even for, you know, even if your intent might not be for general publishers to be able to do it, but if you're managing the site or other people are managing the site for someone, it's kind of an interesting way to think about making changes quick without having to dive into the code.
I've attempted this approach too, just to build the entire site into a structure, which kind of fell apart when it got to choosing templates for everything. So I didn't quite make it.
So yeah, that's the next next and final kind of example in this progression I prepared is I called it website as a tree section. And the idea was, you know, this is the only item in your whole nav here because you've decided to take I just want everything to be managed in a structure so the client can see the whole website as one. And then I modified this to output the entry type on each entry too, because when you start going this way, the problem becomes what Matt said, the layouts. Like you might need 5 different page templates, and each page template has different fields associated with it. So when we start creating these nodes, we're managing all of our content here, but we need to be able to choose which type of page layout we want this to display on. And I think for a small enough site, this might work. If you and with a few enough entry types. On larger sites, you start to run into needing more variations on your entry types, and this gets really confusing quickly because all of a sudden you have a lot of really generically named entry types, which are like landing page left and landing page right, and whatever other odd things you needed to clarify because something about the template had to be slightly different. So, yeah, that's like the website as a template approach. And I think the other thing is, as your list of things grows here, Craft kind of auto loads them. So you actually can't see a whole tree of your website very easily. You get down 20 or 30 entries or whatever it is, and then it's auto loading the next ones. So if you just wanted to edit the contact page, which is the last one in the list or something like that, you've now got to scroll, wait, and then you finally get to your thing or search for it, and then you're starting to treat the content more as a modular content type approach rather than your hierarchy, which you spent so much time on to do.
Yeah, you publish your 800th blog post, and then suddenly your site is just too unwieldy to manage like that.
Yeah.
Well, so have we? Are there any things we're not considering here that we should be considering? This was my.
No, but my ultimate question is why isn't menus out of the box? And it's interesting to me that, you know, there's this series of, you know, they all have some menu tags. You know, you get nav tags that can, you know, be applied to a structure and some different elements. But it's still curious to me why the platforms, you know, Craft in particular, but there are others that kind of fall within the same ecosystem, you know, of kind of, you know, indie commercial CMSs that don't have, a menu component to them out of the box.
What do you think is the right menu solution to have out of the box?
Well, I mean, what's kind of interesting is you highlighted 3 plugins that, albeit different in terms of some bells and whistles, at their heart are functionally the same. You know them better than I. I've used one of them.
I agree, and I think when you compare them to building out a structure, they're all very similar to something that I was able to set up in 5 or 10 minutes for this presentation. And if I was doing this on 10 websites a year or whatever, I would have a pattern that I could pull from and twig macros that I could pull from to redo that stuff in my own way. But yeah, so I think it comes down to me. It comes down to usability, and I'm not sure if I'd want it out of the box. I think just due to the number of ways we've looked at today that you can do this, if it comes out of the box, what if you choose one of the ways that it didn't come out of the box for? Then you have this whole concept in the system that's there that you're not using, that you either have to hide or not present to somebody because you've chosen to keep it simpler or make it more complex than what they have there. So I think you run into a challenge of is it going to fit every use case? So I like the flexibility now in that we have all of these options to choose from.
And it stays. It keeps from being too opinionated. And even as Marion points out, she probably has some fabulous macro that does this really well. That's like a perfect solution. And in some cases where these add-ons may be or plugins may be completely appropriate for another. So I actually kind of like that it's not out of the box, and I wish it's common enough that it feels like there should be something. I don't know. Quicker to drop in, but then it's not like a plugin is hard to install. So I'm just going to end my ramble there.
I think plugins get to start to solve the problem of usability, I think, Seth, where they get to remove the fields that are unnecessary from the default solution, allow you to kind of custom, and maybe this is where the plugins could improve, where I actually think the default structure right now gives you more flexibility to only add the fields you need on top of something, where you could even have multiple entry types in your structure section that had different groups of fields depending on what type of navigation item it was or something like that. So like you have a lot of flexibility to customize your UI, but the plugins are going to have more experience solving that problem and can customize a lot of the UI towards those needs over time. Michael says, I think the big thing that separates the plugins from coding it directly or using existing structures is being able to identify that this is the active and I want to start the nav X levels above that and 2 levels below. So and Michael's Michael's the author of the Navin plugin. And he says, and more importantly, to do that without running through a million conditionals, just taking advantage of the nested set. So, yeah, I think this is a good point, whereas when you're dealing with more complex navigation in code, there's a lot of different scenarios where and I think Michael probably hit one of the more challenging ones, where you have some page where you need to start on the 3rd sub-navigation item and get it to highlight properly and show its descendants properly, and I think he's probably one of the people more familiar with knowing how to solve that challenge in a consistent way.
And I mean, and the other piece to it too, again, just to have fun with the conversation is, WordPress is a great blog, but we're all probably not using it as our primary platform, because as soon as you try to have it do all the things that everybody can make it do, it for lack of a better word, starts to become an unpleasant experience. Or you're using advanced custom fields, which is a monstrous add-on to allow you to have content flexibility, and it's like, so even by the simple fact of like I'm looking at this screen and this screen is about entries and I'm managing navigation.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing entry-related content related to my navigation, and I'm going to be, maybe to Michael's point, wrangling with entry-related tags, and ways to try and get at what I want for navigational purposes. That's where it starts to feel like, yeah, I can do that, but do I really want to do that? Is that really, does it just you can, and I love the idea of doing as much out of the box as you possibly can. I'm very conservative when it comes to plugins, but it's been interesting that over the course of that half a dozen or so of our earlier sites, we made some wrangled and made some decisions that was going to be one of the plugins that we're likely to use in a lot of cases. We'll try to avoid others, in other cases, just because of that, kind of just that even our experience of it, we want to be able to have, some degree of flexibility in controlling the nav, and, some of our nav decisions don't make sense to be hard-coded, for the folks that we're building sites for. So, that's it. That it's made more sense to us. That said, when I'm in the about area and I've got a set of subpages for the about area, and my primary nav is pretty simple, and we have done this. Our primary nav's been hard-coded. When you hit about, you're hitting a structure and you've got your subpages, and that to me was like, I wasn't using the structure necessarily to build a nav. It was the content and its relationship to each other was the nav. Mm-hmm. It didn't require another level of description, to define how those pages are related to each other from a navigational or or architectural standpoint.
Yeah. So. Yeah, I think those are. Yeah, I think that's where we get. I think this is where the more complex navs become an interesting combination of a lot of these approaches. Maybe you have to control some level of the nav, and you need to keep that control in one place and intuitive. But then, how does everything else fit together in a way that handles that? Matt, do you have any thoughts? This current big nav you've been thinking through, like different parts of that nav that you've identified as challenging or that don't fit into these models very well?
Not completely. I mean, we have places where we jump back and forth between defining structure and then having sometimes actual entries that we wouldn't explicitly add to a navigation would automatically show up underneath it. Just various weird little cases that I'm thinking about. I'm still stuck on. So Marion just said, new idea. What about putting the nav data structure in the config and then displaying it with the twig macros, which makes me think that I think on every hangout there should be a segment where Marion shows how you could do whatever you're talking about with a twig macro. But I think this is a really interesting idea because one of my hesitations with this big site is, like Seth was saying earlier, just a vague hesitation relying on a plugin. I can make a plugin, and I know how I don't maintain my free plugins necessarily. And a lot of times I'm reluctant on taking something that important and critical and central to the site functionally and relying on it. So I'm actually wondering now if I could be clever enough to take the Marion route and keep the data in some I don't know, inexpensive format like a config or something like that, and just write fabulous macros that would be complicated but also completely out of the box to deal with it. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, Ben. I'm just kind of I'm taking it all in and thinking through different weird cases that we have. But the idea of using a plugin to start at a particular point in a tree or highlight here is kind of central to my concerns with the site.
I think another question I'd like to ask on this is like where all of this costs money, creating it, maintaining it, all of this. And so there's always the question to me of where do you want the cost to be when you have a change? So I think a lot of the client pressures there are, well, and a lot of times when we start new development relationships, the client doesn't know you, you don't know them, and there's this like, well, we don't want to be dependent on you in the case that things don't go the way we want them to. And so frequently clients will ask for kind of, well, I just want to be able to control it at the end of the day, which means I want the costs of creating it to be upfront, and I want the costs of maintaining it to be my own labor hours. Whereas if you have a longer term relationship where you're in a retainer or something and you have 10 hours a month for small fixes in something, you're in a relationship where somebody might say, well, I don't need those costs to be upfront. I know, every 6 months when I have a small navigation item to change, I'm going to send you a note and say, hey, can we update this? You take a half hour and do it, and that was a half hour of labor costs on the developer side, and there's no maintenance costs on the client side beyond knowing what they want to do or something like that. So I think depending on the complexity, because I think sometimes when you say we want control, the costs shoot way up in the development costs, and you might be bringing the average cost of change down, but if you're only doing that once every 6 months, is it really worth an extra 10 hours of time or something like that to build out a more complex nav, or is it really worth a half hour of whatever the labor cost is to bring it up now and then and have your current developer make that change for you? And I understand there's not a perfect relationship in that. Sometimes you do need some level of control, and you can't be relying on everything. But, yeah. But I think frequently projects do have kind of a fixed price starting point. So if you have a $5,000 project, I think it's a good question to ask. Well, do you want X percent of that project going into making the nav editable, or do you want X percent going into making your product more saleable or marketable? However.
Well, this risk is a factor too. There were a few expression engine sites that we built using structure where you can, for anybody not familiar with it, you can drag and drop pretty much the entire sitemap instantly, and you can instantly rearrange your site. And somebody that may not know any better but has the ability to rearrange the entire site because it could look cool, could wreak havoc on SEO and different other things. There's kind of a risk component that goes along with control too. That if you have a site that has maybe dozens and dozens of editors or something, everybody with a different focus, if they have access to these things, that can also be sort of a liability as well. So it may actually be cheaper to have to be forced to go through a nerd to get your navigation updated. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic that's been so different on different projects. It's almost kind of entertaining.
I agree. I mean, we're kind of, with the way tools have evolved, I mean, we're at the point where we really could deliver a 100%,
editable,
control panel managed content as well as functionality website. There's, between globals and the variety of different, content types that you can roll out, anything and everything could be editable, and it's something we've experimented with. That we have delivered sites that are 98%, 95% editable through the control panel, and it is costly. It's a great question of just, well, could we shave 10% of that editability and spend that money elsewhere, or that time elsewhere, or just have a lower budget, or whatever the case may be. But on the flip side, it's an interesting, it's an interesting dynamic in terms of the relationship, with your client, in terms of how do you have those types of conversations, in an informed way and in a strategic way, that some of those decisions can be made. Are you putting together documentation about every piece of content on a given page and say you could edit these and you can't edit these, and that's okay, and here's why, or how do you manage that in an efficient way, which is an interesting project management type challenge, when you're going through it. So yeah, no, right on. I mean, it's all of it's tricky. I mean, that's where plugins come in. Is they save time generally to do more complex functionality. But there's trade-off from that. There's risk. There's update. There's the possibility that those get abandoned. Or break, and then you're beholden to them. And there's challenges in that regard as well that might come back to bite you later.
Here's another related question on this. What in your experience, how much do navigations change? And I ask it in the context of if you've decided we need a complex navigation and it's going to take 20 or 40 hours to build or whatever it takes, there's some relationship between when you build that and then some for future point in time when you learn, oh, we can improve on this. So you probably want to keep costs low as much as possible until you have that moment of like, oh, we understand if we did this right, the users get it, we don't need to move it around, or something like that. So maybe there's a case where you actually want to hard code it right out of the box or something like that and wait till there's a demo or something and then decide, hey, now we're going to choose to implement it with this plugin, or maybe we learn nobody's ever going to need to edit it, so we don't need to do that. But maybe there's a point where you realize, hey, like, let's now invest the time to spend the 40 hours making the navigation super editable because we've took our 4 hours and mocked up something that works and have learned from that. Bad at ending on a question, aren't I?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out.
Yeah, the upfront costs. So, like, is it worth taking time upfront before you commit to a navigation strategy to experiment with different navigation strategies?
I think it probably depends a lot on what the relationship between the navigation and the sitemap is. Because I've worked on projects where cosmetically the navigation will change, where maybe even the level of things that you interact with on the front end changes, so you can suddenly navigate more fluidly to subpages where before they would have been promoted differently or something. And I think that's very, 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 very different from a site where the entire site structure could change often. And I think the answer to that question depends kind of on the relationship between the navigation elements and the navigation widgety bits and the sitemap itself, and how intertwined those things are. So how's that for a non-answer? Sorry.
No, I'm just trying to think of project sites or business types or scenarios where your navigation changes a lot. I think if you add a new division or a new product or something, like you rebrand, these are scenarios where you might have significant navigation changes. Outside of that, I don't know where your navigation's changing as much. Maybe you're adding more help pages or something dynamic, but I feel it's less structural. You kind of commit to a structure for a while, and then you rebrand or add a new or remove a product or something, and have to kind of shift gears.
Yeah. I think I think you're right. I mean, I think you do have.
I feel like the change that we. I mean, sometimes it's partially just knowing. It's knowing the client. It's knowing what they're trying to do, what strategically the site is about, and their content, and where they are in their strategic thinking. I think. There are certain cases where you can, even with a new relationship, where you can get a vibe that that's really not going to change that much. That that they have it either pretty well thought out, or it's very simple, or whatever the case may be. That that those categories or that structure or the taxonomy of things is somewhat set. Then there are other cases where you can kind of get a feel that they need some variability, and they might not need complete variability. Maybe they need variability at that secondary level, and that's something that's really common for us. That the primary nav might be relatively fixed, but the secondary nav, the elements within that, might be quite variable. you know, in terms of adding new or revising or changing. You know, I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like, you know, I think that's where we are most of the time, you know, where we'll think of, you know, try to think about what are those big buckets, you know, as being something that'll be more consistent and make sense and simple. But then this you know, the trail that those buckets might lead to, you know, depending on the site, might evolve or change or, you know, grow or shrink.
You mentioned right at the beginning how the Happy Logger site kind of had a branded nav that you can't add elements to it. So that might be another way to approach this, is where part of your nav is branded or part of the design in a way that it is unchangeable unless you have a designer or somebody involved, and then part of your nav is kind of dynamic sub-nav below that, where you have more flexibility and control over components. We have Marion shares, my experience is the navigation changes a lot while the site is being designed and then not afterwards. The problem is frequently people want the site developed before it is all designed. So I think, any of us can relate to that challenge of kind of the design components changing. And I've found navigation to be some of the most expensive changes at the wrong time in projects. If your whole template structure is designed around a certain way that an advanced navigation is working successfully, and then some component of it changes how it fits in the layout, you sometimes have very big cascading changes of how that navigation affects tons of other elements which you'd already kind of gotten in place. All right. Well, we hope that we solved all of Matt's problems. We can pick another version of this talk some months down the road, where we explore other types of navigation on the list and get into some of them more. All right. Any final comments, folks, before I wrap up?
No.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Next week we'll be talking about Flexbox and Craft. This has been another Straight Up Hangout. The event will be posted on the website shortly afterwards, and we hope to see you next week. Have a great day.
Thanks, Ben.